Hi, and welcome to the Leadership Untitled podcast, the show that brings together leadership and/or L&D experts to help leaders out there understand the traps that may be sitting in front of them and helping them how to avoid them, usually because we've fallen into them ourselves. This week, my guest is Andrea Newton. Andrea's headline on LinkedIn says, "Confident conversations can change organizations, develop relationships, improve results, and save lives." How many times have your consultants added the bit about saving lives? And Andrea's story includes saving her own, to become a leadership expert who does exactly that, saves and changes lives. Now, a number of people flagged Andrea to me as someone I simply had to invite onto the podcast, and I'm glad they did. As Andrea says, it's time to get comfortable with the uncomfortable. Hi, Andrea. Welcome to the Leadership Untitled podcast. How are you today?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you. And you?
Oh yeah, really good, really good. Not bad at all. Looking forward to a great conversation with you on the back of the chat we had the other week. I think it's important to let the listeners know that it was actually a post I put out there on International Women's Day that the people I tended to go out to. Oh, I kind of step back a second. I looked at the list of guests that I had on my podcast, and it was all male. Now, there was a couple of reasons for this, I think. As I started getting reflection a little bit, I went, most of the people who I've followed and have kind of followed for years have tended to be these male role models in L&D.
Sure.
But then I also kind of checked myself and went, have I actually been approaching female leaders and L&D leaders and business leaders? And the answer had been yes. So I was like going, okay, I wonder what the difference is here. And I don't know what it was, but I put out on International Women's Day and said, could anyone nominate any fantastic examples of female leaders, L&D leaders or thought leaders or anything like that? And that got people really energized and they started putting names forward. And I kind of reflected on the back of that and went, is it, and this would be interesting for us to get into part of the conversation in a bit, maybe, because I know we talked a little bit about gender when we were chatting the other day, is that it seemed to me that the men that I approach have no problem in singing their own praises and wanting to talk about everything. But it's kind of more taken with the females. It's taken that other people have nominated them more and actually sung their praises for them. And then when you actually speak to people, then they will, but they don't necessarily put themselves forward in the same way. So anyway, on the back of that, the reason I'm speaking to you is you had more than one nomination in there, calling you a fantastically inspirational leader. And that's the last time really I want to refer to the fact that you're female, because you're on here because you're an inspirational leader. And that's what all of those people that were commenting on my, and in fact, I think it was the only one where people were actually commenting into other people's recommendation. Going, oh yeah, you absolutely need to speak to Andrea. She's amazing.
I thought you were going to say you'd chosen me because none of those fantastic inspirational leaders were available today.
No, not at all. No, you absolutely are one. I think it's absolutely crucial because, I mean, just from a completely level-headed point of view, my podcast and myself run the risk of it all sounding very one-dimensional, in the sense that it's kind of that middle-aged guy point of view of L&D and leadership in the world, and quite a large portion of the problem is down to the fact that it's all me.
Yeah.
So what I want to do is I want to kind of get into a number of things with you, but I think first of all, for the people listening in, if I could do a bit of an introduction with you.
Yeah, sure.
Just to find out kind of your background, your business that you run at the minute, and sort of things really that have meant people have got off the backsides and nominated you.
Okay, cool.
Go for it.
So, where to start? I like to tell people that I'm 27, but sadly that isn't the case because I've been involved in L&D for 28 years now, so going some.
Started in the womb.
Yeah, I did, absolutely. Primary school, there I was. But my first ever job actually wasn't in HR or L&D at all. I was actually in sales. And it was my disappointment at trying to find a decent trainer to come and train my salespeople that actually got me, sort of involved in this arena. And it was a little bit of the arrogance of me that went, well, I can do better than that. But me being me, I went and did the whole, now I am going to show my age because it was IT CIPD then back in the day. That was before CIPD had even been invented. So I went and did all the bits of paper and moved into a proper L&D role, then became part of the HR department. And I was working for a large international logistics organisation. So that's where I learned to swear in 5 languages. So
just out of interest, what sort of piqued my interest there is obviously you're in sales and you couldn't find the right person to train your salespeople. What was lacking? What were you finding? What was frustrating you?
What I kept finding was they all wanted to tell us how to do features and benefits and how to sell central heating and double glazing. Yes. And actually, the business that we were in was far more consultative. It was far more about not having that process that you followed where you kind of, did all sorts of wrestling holds to get the buyer to say yes. But it was much more about relationship building. It was much more about understanding the business. It was much more about an ongoing partnership arrangement. Yeah. And so a lot of the kind of trainers, if you like, the sales trainers that I was talking to simply weren't talking that language. And that really put me off. So I decided I could do better myself.
Well, it's at the heart of a part of my vision, really, and of this podcast, is that the L&D teams and the trainers aren't the be all and end all of this sort of stuff. No. It is actually the leaders of those people that I think play the biggest part of the role in it. I compare it quite often to kind of to parenting, that parents have got a massive responsibility to bring up their kids. That they own that responsibility. Yes, the school does a lot of the teaching and education and bringing all that along. It's still the responsibility of the parent, in my opinion. So in the same way, you as a leader then went, I can do this, and you started getting involved in that. So kick back into your little history story.
Okay, so as I say, that took me more into a HR role because I suddenly found that I'd got all sorts of people creeping into my training sessions. So even though I was originally looking after sales and customer service for the whole of the UK, I was then finding that I'd got managers sneaking in because they wanted to look about how they improved their communication or how they dealt with, challenging in conversations with customers where it had gone wrong operationally and so on. So I ended up moving into a more generalist role, part of the HR team, and was in that job for a good few years, senior leader in the business, all going fine and dandy until we got a new chief exec who was French. And with that came a belief that women were either decorative or administrative.
Oh, wow.
Now, clearly, I'm neither of those, so decided that perhaps wasn't the place for me to be. And shall we just say I left on a gentleman's agreement.
Okay.
And started going for the jobs in L&D and within HR roles, and was being offered jobs, but coming away from interviews not thinking, yeehaw, can't wait to get going. It was a kind of, if I get it, I get it. If I don't, I don't. Nothing was really exciting me.
Okay.
And then purely and simply, as often is the case, I got a call from a management consultancy that I'd been using to do some work with our senior leaders. And they said, we've heard you're not working at the moment. Do you fancy doing a little bit of freelance for us whilst you're looking? Money in your pocket sort of thing. And that, as they say, is kind of where it all began. Mm-hmm. And I really loved the opportunity and the variety and the chance to really kind of focus in on some stuff that really mattered to me. And so my business was born, and I've just celebrated 21 years as a self-employed consultant.
Congratulations, that's fantastic.
Yeah, so I can no longer pretend that I'm only 27, unfortunately.
28, although, go with 28.
All right, maybe. Although, my son is 23 and he has said to me, Mother, for God's sake, the time has come. You really do have to admit. So that's me. I've been kind of rocking around for the last 21 years. I've had some fantastic experiences. I've had some really awful experiences. I've delivered big contracts to people like ITV, Iceland Foods, Warburton's, the NHS, the fire service. And equally, I've worked with some delightful small clients. Like one of my most favourite was an importer of fine wine. They were nice people to be around. So,
Was that a slightly different invoice you did for that one?
Yes, slightly different. In fact, I think I owed them by the end of the project. I made the mistake of going to one of their fairs because they said to me, come along and have a look at, how we work and our branding and, get to know us. And I ended up placing an order. But I didn't know then that wine only came by the crate if you ordered it from such places.
Yeah.
And I suddenly found myself with a rather hefty bill. But given that they were a client, you can't lose face. So I just stood there with my visa and went, yes, that'll be lovely. Thank you.
Yes, please. Yes, sign me up for a subscription. Yes, I'll have one a month.
But I have to say, that completely changed my view on wine. And I can now tell the difference between a good and bad wine at 100 paces.
Oh, brilliant stuff.
So, yeah, so I've had some really good experiences. I've worked with some absolutely amazing people. But I've also had some horror stories, but naming no names, there we are.
So you mentioned you were applying for jobs and nothing was really sitting up there and made you take notice of them. Now that I guess at the time, maybe when you were sort of like 6 to 12 months into doing your own thing and you started to go, this is what I want to do. What was it that had been missing from that job search? What were companies not offering that retrospectively you went, that's why nothing was jumping up?
I think there's a couple of things if I look back. I think part of it was about my values. For me, values like honesty, truth, integrity really matter. And I'm not into ticking boxes. No. And I think a lot of the jobs were driven by, this is what the business is going to tell you, crack on and deliver it. And sometimes, in the grand scheme of things, with all due respect, the business might not necessarily have all the answers, or the business might be so caught up in its own little piece that it isn't seeing the bigger picture, it's not seeing where the business is heading, that kind of stuff. So I think there was part of that. I wanted to be able to feel as though I was using my brain, that I was able to influence, and that, it was okay to challenge where appropriate, rather than just, can you arrange some training for this, tick this box, complete that certificate. At the time it was BS 5750, ISO 9000, and all of that NVQ kind of stuff. So it just didn't excite me.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you talk about how long you've been in business now, 21 years. I defy any L&D head of or director to come to me and say they've not been made redundant or in a massive restructure in 21 years, because I think you're hitting the nail on the head that those, so often it becomes tick box. So often it becomes delivery of a project that's been initiated and signed off elsewhere.
Sure.
And you're just part of the cog to get it done. And that pours into my vision of around, it's all too often those teams don't add value to the organization. And, I don't think it's by intent. They don't want to turn up and be ineffective. But I think by doing it from an outsider's point of view, when you go in, and interesting if you find this, the desire, it could be the same people you were working with yesterday, but you were inside the company then. Now you're not. It tends to be that they are listened to just a lot more because you've come in from an external perspective rather than being inside to try and change it. Do you find that?
I'm not sure, to be honest, because I do think relationships count for a lot when you're looking to change or challenge. And so I do think sometimes internally it is a bit more about building the relationships with the right people. But it's also thinking about, what do you want to be known for? As L&D professionals, we often focus very much on our learners. And actually, I don't think often enough we think about our own credibility, our own position, our own reputation. And so I think there's a bit of that goes on as well. And also I think, if I am honest, I am a bit of a gobby northern bird. So I don't sort of, take well to, this is what we're going to do, take it or leave it. And there's times when I've gone after work as a freelance and I've actually walked away from it because I felt that what they were looking to do wasn't going to deliver the outcome they were trying to achieve. Yeah. And I'm a very results focused, outcome driven person. And I like to feel that whatever I do absolutely makes a difference to the business. You know, it makes me sound like Miss World. I want to travel the world and be nice to small children. I don't want to do that, but I want to feel as though the effort that I put in, the energy that I'm prepared to invest in your business is actually going to deliver the outcome, you know, that we all want. It's that sense of pride, that sense of satisfaction. And I don't think you do get that as an internal L&D if you're just ticking boxes and organising mandatory, you know, health and safety, manual handling, you know, all that kind of thing, which sometimes does, you know, kind of fall into that remit. So I think it helps as well being a little bit gobby.
Well, just confident to actually raise what you actually think, because quite a lot of the leaders that I work with and coach in the world of L&D, they have these opinions and they have these thoughts, and the reason they got into it are very similar to the reasons you run your own business and that I run my own business. But over the years, it kind of just chipped away and they got almost trapped in this world of ticking boxes and running out those mandatory learnings and all those sort of things. And you hit on something there that I think is crucial in that world, is that L&D, and this was probably one of the latter learns of mine, was that they're very good, just like the trap that regular operational leaders fall in, of kind of saying, this is what others should do.
Yeah.
This is best practice. This is this is this. But I think, you know, I was probably one of the few at the time when I was working in the big team to see that in the operation and challenging that. Like, as a leader, this is your role, and what are you going to do to help the people? Blah, blah, blah. But what I wasn't that good at was actually then going, hang on a minute. I need to be holding the leaders of L&D, including myself, to account for doing the same thing for us. Notoriously really bad at our upskilling ourselves and giving ourselves development time and all these things we try and push out that way. Is that something you found as well when you were working with and for those teams?
Yeah, very much so. And I think I mentioned to you for a chunk of time, I was also a tutor for CIPD.
Yeah.
And I was seeing a lot of trainers, you know, coming through on that programme, obviously, because over 8 years, I don't know how many hundreds of trainers I helped, you know, do the CTP as it was at the time. And I think just hearing the stories from some of them, and even just the work they had to do for the CTP, some of their organisations didn't support certain parts of it.
Yeah.
And so there wasn't even a complete respect of the whole, if you like, learning training cycle. You know, there was almost sometimes a bit of a knee-jerk reaction. We need a bit of this, let's do that, without any real kind of thought around how that was going to, you know, pan out, what delivery was going to look like, how it was going to impact, how it fitted in with other stuff. And I was seeing a lot of individuals who, you know, really felt as though they were boxed in and didn't have the voice that perhaps they should have had. And I think that's why sometimes whenever companies hit a hard time, it's often L&D or training that gets cut back first, because sometimes I don't think organisations really do see the true value. And again, we're then into chicken and egg, aren't we? Do they not see the value because the value isn't there? Are people not pushing for that value? Are we not delivering, you know, in terms of outcomes? Are we not challenging? Are we not pushing back and saying, actually, this is where, you know, the money should go? Yeah. So, you know, I think there's a lot of things that if I had a magic wand, I'd probably seek to change. But
absolutely, I think, well, L&D just I think by its presence in organisations tends to be one of the line items on a project. And obviously, then if people change the process for which projects are delivered, that team's very much at risk. Instead of it actually being, and you know, I think this is the whole of HR with, or any people function with L&D as well, that if it's brought in at the start to actually be the people champions, to actually understand what change or what a product means or what a system means or anything is to those people, it's not one part of a process. It's actually runs across the entire thing, which makes it more important. I mean, I won't mention the names for obvious reasons, but I can remember once challenging a senior L&D leader that I was working with and said, so if we consult and we look at a design program, and we keep talking to our stakeholder, and we reach the conclusion that there is absolutely no point as learning and training experts in running a training program or e-learning for this, because it will not add any value. But your boss still just tells us to do it. Would we do it? And the answer was yes. And certainly from a personal point of view, the life kind of drained from my face and went,
yeah.
what's the
I
point?
think, to me, that's really disappointing, because chances are whatever the cost and investment and time and energy that was going on that could have been on something that actually was going to make a difference. And, I'm finding, for example, at the moment, with the whole kind of trying to change the narrative around mental health and well-being within organisations, so many are happy to just skim the surface and tick a box rather than put any real weight behind it.
Yeah.
And I do sometimes think that there are times and places where organisations get it a little bit out of balance, and the stuff that really drives, engages, focuses, motivates people, is a bit of a, free fruit Friday kind of initiative, rather than how do we make this part of the overall business strategy.
Yeah. Now I know mental health is a massive thing for you in your approach and what you're trying to do. And when we chatted last week, that really came across that it's at the heart of everything. And you talked about sometimes that because it is only scratching the surface, what organisations do quite a lot, it can be difficult to really get in at that level. So I guess, kind of a two-part question really, that, why is mental health so important to you in helping other people with it? But also, what is that challenge that you find when you then try and make people understand or want to have that influence with those companies?
Okay, can I do the second question first? Because that was probably the easier one. Why is there a reluctance? I think because a lot of organisations are scared. I think they are afraid that if they take the lid off the too hard box, there will be stuff that suddenly has a light shone on it and potentially causes them challenges, sleepless nights. And I think as well, in some places, there's still a belief that actually I can't fix society's problems. And if my people have got poor mental health, then that's for them to sort out with their GP, counsellor, therapist, whatever it may be. Yeah. So I think there's a number of reasons why organisations are sometimes reluctant. And I think really it's about not actually understanding the true value and not appreciating exactly the difference it does make, and fully appreciating their level of responsibility. When I talk to people about health and safety, immediately they think hard hat, high vis, safety shoes. Yeah. When actually, there's very little reference in that regard to mental health and psychological safety. And we know that without those two ingredients, the performance of your team is immediately, kind of disadvantaged.
Yeah. I think we mentioned when we chatted last week, didn't we, that you kind of go back decades and decades to the foundation of all learning courses as well, Maslow. And it kind of goes, we kind of nowadays, I say nowadays, probably for the last 10, 20 years minimum, kind of snobbishly kind of go, oh, that's old now. Don't listen to that. Don't reference that anymore. But it's spot on, because that had all the things you're talking about at the start, making people feel psychologically safe and physically safe in an environment so they felt comfortable before anything else could happen.
Yeah, and there's been masses of research more recently that absolutely demonstrates that, and I think as well, without sort of running ahead too much, because I know I still need to come back to your first question, I think the whole thing of going back to the workplace as the world starts to open over COVID, I'm not sure that employers will have necessarily all realised that the people that left the building last February, March, will be the same people that come back. Yeah. They may be physically, although, I don't know, I'm carrying a couple of extra Corona stones, so they may not even
guilty.
Themselves,
Guilty here.
But I think there's also a piece around, as people are returning, there will be anxiety and people will have lost confidence, and people may have experienced some really tough stuff over the last 12 months. If they've had a bereavement or they've had a relationship breakdown as a result of all the pressures, people are not going to be coming back with a whistle on their lips and a skip in their step just because the doors are open again. Yeah. So I think mental health really goes into that. And I think, one of the biggest challenges is people, when they talk about mental health, they're thinking about mental illness. And actually the two things are quite different. Every single one of us has mental health, but only, 1 in 4, 1 in 6, depending on which stats you read, has a mental health disorder, mental illness. And I think it's about organisations recognising that mental health is nothing more than the way people think, the way people feel, which means it impacts on the way those people make decisions, the way those people interact with others, the way those people present themselves, you know. So the whole mental health agenda, I think, needs to be more than, as I say, Free Fruit Friday, Wellness Wednesday, and, you know, let's do a little bit of MHFA just to tick another box.
Yeah.
And going back to your question before I forget it, because I am quite old and I will forget, why does that matter to me? Because basically I had a period in my life where the wheels fell off completely. You know, herring around the country as this successful, gobby northern bird delivering fantastic training to all these marvellous organisations from Aberdeen to Penzance. And one day the wheels fell off good and proper. And actually, I got to the point where I intended to take my own life because there were so many things going on for me personally that meant I simply didn't have the capacity to cope anymore with the pain that I was experiencing. And I guess one of my biggest learnings from that is because I am a bit of a gobby northern bird and I was brought up that you don't let people know how you're feeling, you keep your mask on, there's no point skriking. Now that might not be a word that everybody realises, but...
No, I get that one.
Right? No point skriking about it. And, you know, if anybody listened to Brené Brown and heard her talk about people being armoured up, that is absolutely my dad to a T. And so I was taught to armour up so that people never knew that, you know, if you weren't coping, you weren't struggling. And as a result of that, everything that was going on in my life was basically contained within my head. But because I am one of the gobby, confident, I can do this on the outside, nobody kind of noticed. And as many L&D professionals, those especially who do stand up, will tell you that you have to develop an ability to put your face on, to stand up in front of the crowd and do your turn. You know, as I say, almost to the point that now if I go to the fridge and open the door, the light comes on, I do a turn. Because I think once you've been in that situation where you're presenting to others, you learn how to just be what you need to be in that moment. So wearing my mask, keeping my face on, high heels, just do it. And, you know, as I say, I got to the point where the wheels fell off completely. I found myself rooting around at rock bottom, peering over the edge, and I had a plan as to how I would make all that stop. So coming back from that, one night I was actually on the phone to the Samaritans, and the lady that I spoke to, I'll never forget, a very Scottish, very gentle, very calm voice. I made a pledge that if I made it through that living hell, that I would use my past to help other people's futures. And my intention in that promise to the universe was that I would go and qualify as a Samaritans volunteer. And then when I did finally to start coming back out of the darkness into the light, I actually realised that I could make far more difference to people if I combined my 26, 27 years of leadership development with the work that I'd been doing and my own experience, but to do it in a way that a gobby northern bird would do. And not to do the academic, therapeutic kind and supportive approach that a lot of other consultants might work with. And, you know, I completely get that that does work for people, but that's not me. And again, that goes back to the honesty, the integrity, doing it in a way that is me. And in order for me to be authentic and real and genuine, I have to do it in a way that goes, right, let's have a conversation about this, because you know what, this really matters, this is why it matters. And I actually went and trained in suicide intervention. Prior to me having that mini apocalypse, I delivered a lot of training within organisations around crucial conversations, tough talk, the ability for managers and leaders to have conversations that matter. And it really just seemed a natural progression to add on the mental health and suicide intervention thing. But as I said, even back in the days when I went to ITD, I had to go and get my certificates, and I chose very carefully about who I trained with. And I actually chose to do the only UK recognised qualification, which is a City and Guilds programme. And so added suicide intervention, and I now offer organisations 7 significant conversations. That kind of range from team leaders, newly promoted, developing confidence, their ability to no longer be their mate, but their manager, all the way through to a recognised suicide intervention programme.
Wow.
And I guess that's why it matters to me. I've been there. I had a really tough time. And it actually gives me a massive sense of satisfaction knowing that whenever I'm talking to a room full of, I don't know, let's use the example. I once got drafted in to work with some site managers, construction site managers, and they were rocking up that morning and giving it, what we're doing here, and what's this one? Lovely, 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 lovely people. And by the end of it, they're walking out of the room, and you know that point when somebody shakes you by the hand and looks you in the eye and says, thank you for today.
Yeah.
That's the point that, as any professional L&D trainer, facilitator, whatever you want to call yourself, that's the point at which you know you made a difference.
Yeah.
And so to me, working with people like that and tackling a subject that is often considered taboo and sensitive, but to do it in a down-to-earth, practical, pragmatic, because you know what, it's just another human condition.
Yeah.
And really be able to make that difference, that's what really floats my boat.
You know, you obviously explained this to me last week as well, and thank you for sharing that on the podcast as well. I completely agree that what you do so well is that even in your storytelling of what happened, just you bring it so naturally to people. It's so straightforwardly told. In what is obviously a very powerful and profound story and a very difficult part of your life. But at no point does it become an academic conversation. At no point is it around the kind of the kind of those teaching details. It is about, let's be open and honest. And I think in everything that I talk about in terms of trust and communication, if you do that, you're going to get that back.
Yeah.
And is that, I guess, is what you find when you talk to people about this?
Absolutely. And what I do get, because of the way that I talk about my own experience and because of the examples that I use to help people understand, what I do get is a room full of people that engage very quickly with what are very sensitive subjects. And, you know, somebody said to me, Andrea's really good at getting the whole room laughing when she's talking about the subject of suicide. Now, that sounds really wrong. And actually, it's about being able to create a climate where people can relax, where people feel okay, because that way, as we all know, the learning is much better. People engage much more, people take it away, and people feel confident enough to ask questions. Whereas if I'm stood there doing and forgive me for this, the pale, grey, stale, male, academic, death by PowerPoint, that doesn't engage with people in the same way. That's when it becomes tedious. And, you know, so if I'm telling stories and, you know, they're absolutely making sure that it doesn't become a woe is me, you know, it's not a dead dog story. It's a kind of, this is what happened to me and this is why it happened. And you know what, that's shit because, and therefore what we can learn is. And, you know, when people discover that even things like our biology impacts our mental health, you know, so I might talk about the middle-aged menopausal woman. Not that I'd know anything about that, because do remember I am only 27. But if I did, I might know, for example, that the menopause is a time when females can be frequently diagnosed with depression and even suicide ideation. What do organisations know about that? You know, is that built into, you know, the kind of EAP, employee assistance programs, etc., etc. You know, and when I talk to people and say, you know, the number of deaths by suicide, less than half were people who were not diagnosed with a mental illness, they're people overwhelmed by life. How many of those people have you got in your organisation? You know, men who are lower paid, lower skilled, men who have less choice in the way that they work, you know, all of those little red flags, all of those things, these are things that organisations need to be aware of. and also recognise the impact that leadership can have on those people. You know, and I always say leadership is an occupational health factor in its own right. And so I guess the way that I bring the subject to people, the way that I talk about it honestly and openly, and quite happily, you know, share my experiences without it becoming, you know, woe is me. I find that really does help people to say, yeah, me too.
Yeah.
And inevitably, after every session, I will get somebody hang back and say, can I just ask? Yeah. And I had a guy, I was working with a really large organisation, blokes who were not used to being trained, certainly in the way that I was in terms of it being the soft skill stuff. You know, they do all the regulatory, the mandatory, all of that good stuff. But actually being invited in to talk about mental health, oh, we don't do that. We don't do pink and fluffy here. And I worked with a group, quite a number of these groups actually before Christmas. And at the end of the session, one guy said to me, he said, you know what? He said, you've just given me permission to talk openly about my daughter. He said, and I've never spoke about her at work because I was never sure that people would be supportive in their reaction to me explaining that my daughter's got a mental health disorder. You have just completely changed my ability to come to work and be me.
Wow.
And we all know that when you can be you, when you can be authentic and genuine, we all know that your performance, your motivation, your commitment, you're striving for higher standards, all of that stuff is ramped up because you're not putting energy into hiding stuff that you don't want people to know about you. And he'd been hiding that for 14 years. He said, you know, he was ashamed of his daughter's condition for fear of what his workmates might say. Wow. Now that's pretty crap, isn't it? For
completely.
Any organisational climate.
Completely, and it's completely the opposite of this kind of what you kind of talk about, this training approach that's out there, that we get people going in and saying we're going to train emotional intelligence. So we'll stand at the front and we'll tell people how to be emotionally intelligent. Right. So we're going to go, right, what I want you to do is I want you to share something we don't know about you. You know, that sort of stuff. It just doesn't work like that. And what you've done so well there is you've removed the barriers to just being naturally emotionally and a naturally you.
Yeah. And you know, that's something another client said to me. He said, oh, Andrew, he said, you don't just bring you to the training, do you? He said, you bring your whole bloody family. Because I do tend to have stories about, you know, and this and that and the other. And, you know, people love a good tale. And it also helps them make sense of it. So in terms of achieving learning outcomes, we deliver on that. But also by telling people stories, they kind of get it and go, oh, yeah, no, I can see, yeah, that kind of makes sense. Yeah. So you're actually getting a much better outcome than any death by PowerPoint ever would.
Absolutely. You mentioned those red flags that leaders could be looking out for in organizations. Yeah. I guess just obviously you probably look back, I assume, and think to yourself that there were red flags for you that you couldn't see because you were in it. So those red flags that you saw for yourself and that organizations now should be looking out for, what sort of things do you find, having done the amount of work you've now done with and for that, seem to be the most prevalent?
I think the most obvious is when you see a change in someone's behaviour, and it may be that person withdraws, doesn't want to connect with others, perhaps isn't as passionate about things that they used to be, doesn't get pleasure from doing stuff that, you know, they may be used to. But employers may notice, first of all, a dip in performance or results, or obviously attendance. And sometimes I don't think we look carefully enough at the reasons for that. We just tend to say, right, okay, we need to do a PDP, we need to do a development plan with this person and blah, 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 blah. Yeah. And it's almost that we almost don't want to cross the line in terms of understanding what the real issue is. Yeah. But, you know, things like a drop in performance, a change in standards, those standards could be work related, those standards could be personal. It could even be, as you know, things like personal hygiene, you know, a withdrawal from situations, or equally for some people, if they're working hard to mask it, what you might notice is actually that they're a bit more out there because they're overcompensating almost. So it's kind of a significant change in a person's behaviour, mood swings. You know, somebody is perhaps a bit more tetchy. With men, it can also come across more as anger, aggression, even violence. It could be in that person's communication. It could be, obviously, we've got lots of people working remotely at the moment. Perhaps it's somebody that doesn't want to put the camera on, or somebody that, you know, looks very uncomfortable on camera. And something that I've been saying to all my clients just recently is, you know, if you have got people working from home at the moment, you can't control the environment that they're working in. You don't know what's going on within those four walls. So it's just about being more mindful that we're not all in the same boat and that everybody isn't having the same COVID experience as you might be. And, you know, looking out for things like, as I say, the behavioural change, communication changes, people who are perhaps complaining that they're not sleeping or their appetite's poor. Or, and I know we joked earlier about the corona stone, but if people seem to be more reliant on drink or, you know, even drugs, all sorts of little factors like that potentially might be a red flag. But it's also about managers knowing a little bit about their people, not so much that they're, you know, turn into a bloody stalker, they're going home rooting through the wheelie bins, but so that they know enough about what's going on for those people. So, you know, if somebody has suffered a bereavement, or somebody is going through a difficult divorce, or, you know, somebody is worried about their kids' futures, you know, it's knowing about that kind of stuff, because what we know is, as human beings, it's often a complex interplay of biology, psychology, past life, current life, that, you know, sort of takes the wind out of our sails, as it were. And if you as a leader don't know enough and don't know your people well enough to be able to spot those little red flags, those signs, those symptoms, then you know what, mate, actually that's where you need to do a little piece of work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's what you talked about earlier on as well with the client of yours that stayed behind, talked about his daughter, I think you said it was. There's that realizing now that I have permission to talk about something.
Sure.
So just being able to notice one of those changes that you mentioned before and be able to say, I've noticed you coming across a little bit differently. What's going on? Is anything going on? Is there anything at work? I'm not going to probe into your work at home life, but if you need some advice, or you need some time, or you need to tell me about something, please feel free. I'm here. I'm giving you that permission without actually saying it.
For sure. But for people to do that, Rob, the conditions for honesty need to be present, which means that as a leader, do I trust you? Do you treat me with respect? Do you treat me as though I matter? Can I risk being vulnerable? So actually, the whole conversations, which is typically where I train people, whether it's a crucial conversation about performance or whether it's a critical conversation about suicide, the fundamental piece underneath that is, as a leader, are you on a day-to-day basis creating a climate where that relationship exists, where there is trust? And actually, if you were to ask me, you know, Andrea, is everything all right at the moment? Would I feel that I could even be honest with you?
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I've seen that in two very different organizations that I worked at, that one, people probably wouldn't share that stuff because they wanted to progress and they didn't want anything being held against them. And in another one, for the same way, they didn't want it being held against them because it wasn't about the fear of not progressing. It was the fear of being let go, because there was that type of culture to it.
Yeah, and you know, there's loads of stats that demonstrate how certain organisations have got much higher figures where people lose their jobs because of mental health. And that whole discriminatory, you know, kind of behaviour, that again is something that we really do need to address. You know, you wouldn't fire somebody off because they've got a broken leg. So why are we so quick to do so with a broken brain? You know, it's just another human condition. Yeah. And that's the bit that I like to think, in my very gobby northern bird kind of way, I'm kind of doing my bit to help people appreciate that. Yeah. And nobody is immune. Let's be really clear. You know, there's loads of stats about high risk groups and all of that stuff. Nobody's immune. Yeah. And the biggest increase over the last few years has actually been in young females. So even though there's loads of fantastic work, which is absolutely needed around men and men's mental health, and, the documentary, like, the ones that have been on TV recently, absolutely applaud that. But we mustn't allow that to take the spotlight off the young females, where the numbers increased by as much as, I think, 52% in some areas.
Again, it's understand your people. Don't put an agenda together to say, right, keep your eye on the men, or keep your eye on the women, or keep your eye on whoever it might be. Have all these conversations. Well, create the culture that allows everybody to feel comfortable enough to say whatever's in their minds. Yeah.
And you know what? Giving me a free banana on a Friday isn't going to compensate for the fact that my boss is a complete twit.
No, but it happens. You're right. I mean, I've been in those places. An ex-boss of mine used to joke, the next thing will be bring your dog to work day, that sort of stuff. And it does. It's like it's a point check-in to kind of go, oh, don't forget, we are thinking about you. But that kind of proves you're not. If you're only thinking about me when there's free bananas on the table,
sure,
but when there isn't. So we mentioned leaders. Then I know you do a lot with leadership. Then, and some of the key things you've mentioned, your 7 confident conversations. You've mentioned the conscientious leader that's on the website as well. So the role of leadership then in all of this. Talk to me about it. What do you do with them? What's your take on it? How can they start breaking down these barriers and building this environment that we're talking about?
Okay, so I use the analogy of the workplace being a bit like a fishbowl. And so as leaders, as L&D professionals, if we've got something that's not working, so let's say our little fish isn't well, we would typically remove it from the bowl and give it whatever treatment it needed. Now that might be we send it on a training course, or that might be it's off sick, or that might be we give it a mentor for a period of time and we fix it so that it's okay now. But if we then put it back in that same fishbowl, and that fishbowl's a little bit toxic, perhaps the water's a bit murky, there's kind of mud around the edges, there isn't the clarity that you might like, there's kind of a big bully fish lurking in that plant, if we don't change the environment, actually the problem just comes back. So to me, my approach around leadership is recognizing, as I said, that leadership itself is an occupational health factor in its own right. And sometimes I don't think leaders appreciate the shadow that they cast. And so the work that I typically do across the 7 significant conversations is really helping leaders think about, how do I create a climate where I'm going to get the best out of my people? And it's not about bloody bells and whistles. It's about creating a climate where we can have open, honest, frank dialogue, where it's okay to say, I'm struggling, or I think there's a better way of doing this, or I think there's an error there. And, really getting leaders to recognize the influence that they have over that climate. Many years ago, I was taught that leadership is the single biggest influence on organizational climate. And I think the last 20 odd years in business has just further confirms that to me. Yourself, you go into organizations, and depending on which department it is, depending on which leader it is, you sometimes feel as though you're in a completely different business because of how it feels to be there. So, it's really encouraging leaders to have that mirror moment where they take a look at themselves and really think about, what climate am I creating? How am I interacting with my people? What is the level of trust? Am I working hard on that whole psychological safety piece? Is it a place where people want to come to work? And that then takes us into employee engagement and motivation, and recognizing, for leaders, the shadow they cast, the influence they have, and, really thinking about the difference they make for their people. And that question, are the conditions for honesty present? I know it sounds really odd and it sounds really formal, but it's one that I would really be encouraging all leaders to be asking of themselves, and fairly regularly, because this isn't just about, can I have a conversation about mental health? This is also about, is it okay for me to say that process doesn't work and we've got a bit of a problem over there? Is it also okay for me to say, actually I screwed up, or am I going to hide that? And it's for leaders then thinking about the impact or implications where people are hiding or suppressing or, you know, kind of putting a brave face on stuff. Because if we're not dealing with the reality, if people can't be authentic, if people can't be genuine, we're never going to get the best out of them.
Yeah. I actually love what you said before when you said, depending on the type or the part of the organization that you went into, the word you use were it can feel different. And I think that's really relevant to kind of talk about the fact that the people within that organization, they're probably being affected by that.
Yeah.
But without knowing, because you kind of going in and you're skipping between departments, and you go, this feels different to that one did, and this one feels different to that one did. They're just part of it. It's become their everyday norm.
Yeah.
And it's building up and up and up. And some of the work I do with leaders, I kind of start with their, you know, when you get home in the evening, are you energized through the work that you've done? Or are you getting home and you're just knackered? And it's not necessarily because of the hours, because sometimes you do a full day or beyond a full day, you go home and you're absolutely full of energy because of the work you've been doing. Sometimes you go and do 4 hours and you come back and you're drained.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. And you know, people may not necessarily realize that that's the environment they are in. But I also think there's situations where people absolutely do realize, and they're going, hang on, over here it feels like this, but over there it looks quite different. It's not fair.
Yeah.
And again, that's where you've then got to really look at what impact is that leader having. And the number of times that in workshops, managers or leaders will say to me, yeah, but that's how I get managed, so I just pass it on. Yeah. And I always say to them, look, mate, you've got two choices. You can either do the, you know, the drain pipe, I'm getting kicked, you're getting kicked. Or you can say, no, actually, I'm going to put an umbrella up. And I'm going to operate under this umbrella with my team in a way that I want to. Yeah. I don't have to pass on the leadership style that I am experiencing.
Absolutely.
You know, but then part of the significant conversations that I train is helping managers to also manage upwards. Yeah, how do you go and have that conversation that says, actually, whenever you do this, this is how I feel?
Yeah, I think that's massively important, because I think lots of young or say new leaders, I find they want to lead in a new way because of their experiences with leaders and their own life experiences. And, you know, all too often I think we go, it has to start from the top. Because, and, you know, and I do agree with the principle that role modeling is massively important in leadership. And ultimately, I also agree with the idea that you get the team that you deserve. Eventually, if you keep pushing a certain way of doing it, the people below you will either leave or they will assimilate to that way of working. But I also think that being able to really shine as an example of a different way of doing this from further down in the organization, to raise a spotlight on it, whilst also trying to work with the senior leadership team, is crucial, because they start to see there is a different way. It's showing an experiment is going to work.
Yeah, for sure. And, you know, thinking back over the years, the number of organisations that I've gone into where they are now dealing with some really complex issues because a simple conversation didn't happen. Nobody had the courage to say what needed to be said, you know, even years earlier. And I've seen managers who inherit problem teams because actually nobody's ever dealt with it. Or it could be that somebody, you know, we don't actually tackle their performance. We just move the problem around the organisation. And actually, it really is about us being brave enough to put big girl pants on and to have conversations that matter. Whether that conversation is with our team, whether it's with our managers, whether it's with ourselves. And, you know, you said that the reason that you'd kind of come across thinking about me on your podcast was International Women's Day. And we know the theme this year was about having the courage to challenge. But I have to say, there is a way to have challenging conversations. And if you just go in there all guns blazing to challenge, you're probably not going to get the outcome you want. So I think it's about having the conversation, but doing so in a way that respects the other person and, you know, accepts it might take time to bring about change, and that actually we might not get exactly what we want, but if we're moving in the right direction, we need to just keep that power behind it. So I think that the challenging conversations are really important, but done in an appropriate way.
Yeah. And I think, you know, there's a bit of self-fulfilling prophecy that if all you talk about is difficult and challenging conversations, then that's probably all you're going to have. It's preparing the environment in the ways that you've been talking about, so honesty can prevail and trust is present. So when it does come around to a conversation being a potentially challenging one, I actually trust, no matter what it is that we're talking about, I trust you.
Thank you. And it's about having money in the bank. You know, again, I'll encourage you to think about it like a bank account, that if you're not making the investments when the going is good, you've got nothing to fall back on the rainy day. And, you know, if you're not doing the good stuff, the positive stuff, the investment stuff, the developmental stuff, when you do need to give somebody some constructive feedback, shall we say, if there's nothing in the account because you've not invested at other times, don't expect to get, you know, the perfect response. And the whole thing has to be balanced. You know, I run a program called Crucial Conversations, and it really is about finding the balance. It's saying what needs to be said, whether that's about performance, attendance, conduct, policies, whatever, but in a way that maintains.
Oh, I've lost you again, Andrea. Oh. Hello. Hello.
Hi, Rob.
Oh, lost you again.
Yeah, you froze again. I don't know why. Is that your...
I don't know, I'm waiting for it to come up. It normally comes up and tells me if something's unstable or something like that.
Okay.
Seem to be okay again now. Let me just check. Right. I've not flicked onto the extenders or anything, have I? No. It's probably the young lad, isn't it, on his Netflix.
You might have to do a bit of editing, but never mind.
Oh, I always have to do a little bit of editing. It's fine. It's all good. Put some eyelashes on me and that sort of stuff. It's scary, some of these filters now. Anyway, that aside, so you're saying about the conversations.
Yeah, the crucial conversations, you know, it is absolutely about saying what needs to be said, whether it's tackling a poor performance issue, whether it's an attendance problem, you know, whatever it is, but doing so in a way that maintains a positive working relationship. Or else otherwise it isn't a conversation that's conducive to good performance. It's basically, we'd call it a bollocking. Yeah. And, you know, lots of organisations still use that approach. But my belief is that if, as a conscientious leader, you're doing the right thing at the right time in the right way, because that's what matters, then you will respect the other person. You will respect that they perhaps have a slightly different view of the world. And actually, you'll make sure that in delivering the message that you're doing so in a way that gets you the results you want, with that person still on side.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've got your 7 significant conversations up in front of me. Do you want to, I guess they're the backbone of the programs that you run. And, and I think you mentioned to me last week that realistically, it's been about conversations all the 21 years you've been running about it. It's been ploughing in and out of these. Do you want to sort of walk us through those?
Oh, okay. There's a challenge for me. I think it's the different conversations kind of address people at different points in their leadership journey, I have to say. And obviously we start with the confident conversations, which is probably, as I said, the newly promoted team leader. That transition from mate to manager can be a bit of a significant shift. So it's, you know, how do we get people from buddy to boss, and how do they develop self-confidence to be able to step into that leadership role? And then from there we take it to, you know, the kind of work that you might need to do in that regard. You might need to challenge, you might need to say, actually, that's not good enough. Can we look at doing it a different way? You know, you might need to have those challenging conversations. You might be expected to now suddenly represent your team at a meeting where you have to bring a different voice because you're now representing the team as their team leader. It might be that we need to get you having coaching type conversations. So how do you develop that team now that you've got it? Because we know that, you know, if it's always direct and tell, you're not going to get, therefore coaching conversations become part of your repertoire. It might be that we need to have those crucial conversations that I said, which is about tackling issues in a way that gets the desired outcome but maintains relationships. We might need to have a performance conversation conversation, but doing so in a way that gets the outcome but maintains the relationship. And then we get into the kind of crisis conversations and the critical conversations, and that's more towards the area of mental health, but talking about mental health in a way that's relevant and appropriate for leaders. It's not about turning you into counsellors or therapists. You don't have to be a mental health expert. It's just about you in your leadership role feeling confident and skilled to have a conversation with a member of your team if they were struggling. And just as I said, in the way that you would if you were doing a return to work interview and somebody was coming back with a broken wrist, you wouldn't hesitate to say, glad to see you back, glad to see that you're doing well. Is there anything that I need to be aware of? Do we need to make any adjustments to facilitate the return? Is there anything that we need to sort out? Have you got any follow-up appointments, physio, that kind of thing? So why can't we have that same conversation around mental health? Why do we want to run for the hills? So it's very much around mental health awareness in the workplace, but it's specifically for managers and leaders in that role, not about getting them to be anything over and above that. And then obviously, that kind of crisis situation, that's just so that people have more of an awareness around suicide. The number of organisations that I've worked with after they've had a suicide and then say to me, we just didn't see it coming. And sometimes organisations will find themselves sucked into the coroner's inquest, because if the family are suggesting, for example, that work has played a part in that person deciding to take their own life, then obviously the organisation can be pulled in and interviewed as part of that, because the coroner has to establish whether the suicide was intentional. So the inquest will look at all aspects of that person's life to determine whether there was sufficient grounds to believe that they intended to end their life. And actually, interestingly, towards the end of 2019, there was an organisation where, as a result of a badly handled merger, a couple of the directors actually got prison sentences on the back of some of the staff taking their own lives, because they said it was a direct result. And I thought the way that the judge summed that up was really interesting. He said it was basically, you didn't deal with the poor leadership, the lack of communication, the complete chaos around the merger. And, that negatively affected these people's mental health to the point they took their own lives. And he said that was akin to having machinery that was faulty and not doing anything about it.
Wow. Yeah,
and so they were held responsible. And so, the work that I do is right across that conversation continuum, right from the newly promoted team leader all the way through to the suicide intervention conversations. But sometimes, I think I said this to you, sometimes organisations are a little bit shy about bringing me in at that end of the spectrum. And so we tend to start around the crucial conversations, because people are okay to admit we need some help with sickness management or, poor performance. But and I guess once they get to know me and that trust that I spoke about is there, then, we can do that wider piece. But there are definitely organisations out there that I've been working with over the last 12 months that have really recognised the impact that COVID and everything like that is having on people's mental health. And I applaud those guys, because, some of them have gone above and beyond in terms of what they've done. And again, I think that will make a difference when people are going back to work and start making choices about, actually, is this an employer that I want to be working
100%.
with?
100%. And even if it's not been them directly, but a colleague that they know and they've seen and they've talked to, it all influences that decision. And I think you're spot on. I think, companies tend to want to deal with the things that they know about to start with. They understand themselves fully, like sickness, absenteeism, and all that sort of stuff. Whereas the other stuff, I think you mentioned it right at the start of the conversation, that so many people and organisations make the mistake of thinking about it as mental illness, as opposed to mental well-being. Stay fit. You go to the gym to stay fit, not just to address an injury that you've got.
For sure.
You can go there to address the injury if you've got one. But you don't start with that. So many people just do it to avoid it and maintain health.
And, I suggest to people that mental health is the same as dental health. every day you do something that's good for your dental health because you recognise that it's important to protect it, so on and so forth. And it really is the same for our mental health. There's lots of things that we could be doing and that organisations could be encouraging. You know, it isn't just up to the organisation, you know, the whole wellbeing piece, but there's definitely things the organisation could be promoting and proactively encouraging. And actually, where the organisation can make the biggest difference is making sure that they've got leaders in place that are fit for purpose.
Yeah, and avoiding just doing something like a mouthwash Monday to kind of bring those two things together.
How witty of you to think of that on the hoof. But yeah, that's absolutely it. You know, it's about having a strategy in place that's a day in, day out. But you can't do that if you've not got the right managers and leaders in place, because the climate depends on their style, their behaviour.
I think your language though really plays into that you use conversations all the way through it. And you also said around the role of the leader, that they don't need to be a counsellor.
No, absolutely not.
Or an expert in these areas.
No, it would be inappropriate if they were. This is training that talks to them in their professional capacity as leaders. It's not so that they can fix the issue. It's so that they can help the person find the fix.
There's a triage element to it. It's understanding and finding it. I think it's been a barrier to I guess a less powerful degree, but nonetheless, I think it talks to the point that for so long, when I've tried in the organisations I've been a part of to get leaders to own more of the development of their people, the pushback has always been, I'm not a trainer, or I'm not a coach. And you kind of go back, you know, this is where I put my hands up and go, the mistakes you've made, and you learn, you try and improve from that. That, you know, this isn't about you being a trainer. This is about you being a coach. This is about you understanding. And this is why I love the word conversation. This is about having the ability to have conversations with your people to understand where you need to provide that help or where you need to help them seek for it. So it might be that you think a coach would be a good thing, but you've had a conversation, and so that's what's brought it out. The analogy I use more than the triage tends to be a GP, that, you know, a GP is really good at finding what the problem might be. However, isn't an expert at solving them all. No. You might need to be referred to any number of places, but that wouldn't have been possible had it not been for the conversation up front.
But I mean, you know, let's break it down to basics. The role of a leader is to get the best out of their people. How can you do that if you don't know them, you don't engage with them, you don't have honest, open, frank dialogue with them? How do they know, you know, how do they even know what good looks like if you don't give feedback, if you don't have crucial conversations? And actually, if I am struggling with an issue, but I don't trust you and I don't feel I can talk to you, let's accept that means my performance isn't going to be great because my energy, my focus might be somewhere else. So it's in your interest as a leader, if you want to do a great job, to, you know, actually spend time and effort and energy investing in this stuff, because that's the way that the best leaders reap those rewards.
See, I can't imagine there's many people that will be listening to this that would go, no, I disagree. We will need to trust in an organisation. Everyone agrees that trust is a good thing. Everyone will agree that working together and understanding each other is a good thing. So in the organisations that you've worked with, what's the kind of top reasons why that people aren't working in this way? What's the barriers to this type of relationship and conversation happening?
I think in some organisations, there's still very much a history or legacy of the way we do things around here that they're still working through, particularly in organisations where there was a strong hierarchy and, you know, kind of you do this, you don't do that, and there's a chain of command. So I think there's still shift happening there. And, you know, don't get me wrong, there's always going to be a time and a place where that directive leadership style is needed. I'm not saying that we do away with that completely. You know, I work with the fire service. If it was my house that was on fire, I wouldn't want them to rock up and have a chat about it. You know, I want somebody to go, you do this, you do that, you do the other, because... But then when the emergency's over, I want them to do a debrief in a way that goes, what did you learn? What do you think? What could we have done differently? So I think part of it is maybe hierarchical and the fact that some of that history is still there. I do think part of it, if I'm honest, is fear. because I do think that in this country, we will promote managers without necessarily giving them the development that they need to be effective. And so a lot of them hide behind the fear of, shit, if people get too close, they're going to rumble that, you know, maybe I don't know what I'm doing. And so by leading in a way that keeps people at arm's length, means you'll never quite see that I'm a bit nervous because I don't feel fully confident and capable in my role. So I think there's a bit of that. I think there's also a little bit of the whole vulnerability piece, that I don't want to be seen as kind of being vulnerable. But I also think, and a lot of the stuff that I do with mental health and the suicide awareness, is people get anxious that they don't know enough, they don't know the solution, they don't know what to say. And that's where I think it comes all the way full circle to L&D being able to influence the agenda to make sure that we've got people in positions where they are comfortable and capable of doing a great job.
Absolutely. And that's where it kind of comes down to then. So we kind of come full circle and go, the role of L&D and HR teams in organisations that have done so much in the past, maybe around things like leadership development programs and training sessions and so on. You know, what's other than obviously bringing your good self in to start that ball rolling with them, what are the things that they could be doing from day one, the easiest stuff to start with, to start getting their organisations working and thinking and talking in this different way?
I think, again, it goes back to climate, because I think everybody has a part to play. And the number of organisations that will say to me, come and do some work around confident conversations, which generally means we want to get people talking better. But then you get in there and they go, yeah, but not about that. Shush, don't talk about that bit. So I think it is about people being signed up to a commitment to actually create a community. Because if you think about it, in this day and age, we don't have communities in the way that we did perhaps in the past. You know, we don't have everybody going to the pub on a Friday night on the way home. Well, we certainly don't have them going to the pub at all at the minute, but you know, that kind of traditional thing. We don't have churches in the same community as perhaps the way it used to be back in the day.
In fact, even the post office was a community.
Indeed. And now my post office is combined with a library, and I can't keep up with whether it's open or shut. But anyway, that again might just be my age. So I think it's about creating a climate that encourages conversations, whether that is the cleaner saying this is rubbish, it doesn't work, or whether that's the MD actually walking around the shop floor and going, tell me what you think about that process. It's about conversations that matter, and creating a climate that encourages, that supports, and that gives permission for those conversations to happen.
100%. That's the biggest thing. I think you said something about, I think halfway through, when you said quite often when something starts affecting performance, the first thing we do is go in with the performance improvement plan. Boom, the result hasn't been hit, we need to do something about it. Boom. Don't tell me anything else. I'm not here to talk about home or anything like that. Or like you say, permission wise, it's not something I'm going to bring forward. But yeah, absolutely. Really, I think, and higher up than the leader as well. You mentioned about leaders that go into those roles again, and from day one, they're not really prepared for what it actually means, and in some ways have to try and prove to teams what it is that their role now means and why they're in that. And I think, you know, if L&D again and HR, I think, play a key role in this, in being able to work with senior leaders to go, let's get a very consistent and clear conversation going with the entire organization about what leadership is in this organization,
and
how it shows up.
What does good look like?
And
let's not just have 5 words painted on the wall in reception that we say, these are our values, but actually we don't then walk the walk.
100%.
You know, all that stuff around giving people the support, giving them the development. 9 times out of 10, you know, leaders get promoted because they were good at the job they were doing. That doesn't necessarily mean that they'll be good at leading that job.
No.
You know, I mentioned to you my site managers. Mackie's odds, some of those will have been promoted to managers because they dug a good hole or they laid a brick. And actually, the interpersonal skills, the ability to connect with people, all of that they're not bothered with, which is why, you know, for example, things like the construction industry, where it isn't pink and fluffy and we don't talk about feelings, why there is such a big issue around things like suicide. You know, the construction industry has one of the highest figures. And I am convinced that a lot of that is to do with the nature of the work. It's to do with how they support and lead people. You know, there's all sorts of factors that contribute. And I know that there's a lot of work being done in that industry in that regard. So I think it's not just about, you know, if you go and do all the work on the top, it's a bit like putting lots of fancy decorations on your cake, but your actual basic recipe for your cake is flawed.
Yeah, it's that appearance from the outside at all levels, whether it's individual people or it's the company. It's hiding what's going underneath.
We can do nice and shiny training interventions and tick a few boxes, and we can call it a leadership development program and keep bringing people back for 6 or 12 months. But actually, are we changing the foundations? Are we creating that fishbowl where your little fish has got clarity and space and air and isn't going to get jumped on by somebody, you know, in a dark corner kind of thing?
I know what you said earlier on about how people are feeling. What you've done so well and the way you've described your conversations is that it's different for leaders at different parts of their journey. How does it feel to be a new manager on day one? How does it feel to be a new manager on week 2 versus 40 years into being a leader of people? Very, very different and quite scary. One of the, I always say that the most stressful time I've ever had at work was the first 3 months of being a first-time leader in a permanent leadership role. Because I thought, how do I now distinguish between what I was doing and what I now do? How do I show that I'm worthy of this role? And I'm supposed to have all the answers now, because I used to think my boss would have all the answers. And it was so stressful. I need something completely different to the 40-year tenured leader in the organisation.
Very much so. And that's why in an ideal world, we wouldn't just be promoting them because they were good at the job they were doing. We would be doing something that identifies and develops the potential to become managers or leaders before we put them in that place. And so it's all kind of, you know, you said what needs to happen. For me, it's all interwoven. You know, it's that whole kind of, we've got leaders in positions that they don't feel comfortable, they don't have the courage in themselves, and that's because they've not been developed, which in turn means that they don't know. And, you know, it all just keeps going round and around. It's a bit of a vicious circle. So organisations that have been brave enough to step off that wheel and say, right, actually, this is what we need to do. This is where we need to start, and at least start to unpick some of that stuff. You know, but as you said, with L&D and HR, completely part of that strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. Underpinning it all the way through rather than just jumping in at the end of it or something like that.
Yeah, rather than just being the policy police that we go
ticking the box,
when the wheels fall off.
Doing the D&I training to say, oh, we should all really think about this when we do things. And now we've ticked that box. Go back to your job.
Indeed. Thank you very much.
I've absolutely loved that conversation. And it varied as it is, and I've got loads of notes on there. So we've got to the point now where I think, Andrew, we need to decide on what the title for our episode and our conversation is going to be. Now, I'm very conscious you've already got 7 different types of conversation titles in your framework. You have to come up with another title for another conversation now.
I think in terms of a title, I think something as simple as conversations really do matter. Because I believe that conversations can change organisations, and conversations can even save lives.
Yeah.
I know that as little as a 20-minute conversation can save a life.
Yeah.
So I think I really do want to just push the message, conversations matter.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a fantastic message to put under there.
I really do. And are we creating the climate where they can?
Yeah. And if not, what can be done to either build that climate or what can be removed to let that climate just come to the front?
Sure. Yeah, because it isn't always about adding stuff in. It might be about taking stuff away. You know, think about the fishbowl. Maybe you've got too many plants. Maybe you've got too many fish. Maybe your cleaning routine isn't, you know, good enough, whatever it might be. But it's, you know, it's really thinking about, are we giving our people the best possible chance of success given the climate that we're creating?
Definitely. So if people would like to get in touch with you and follow you to see what you're up to, or actually try and engage with some of the stuff we've been talking about today, what's the best way for them to do that, Andrea?
Typically, people will find me on LinkedIn. I'm generally ranting and raving about something in a gobby northern bird kind of way. And my website is confidentconversations.co.uk. And it'd be good to hear from people.
Perfect. So for the people listening to this, I will pop those links into the descriptions on both YouTube and also the podcast versions of this, so people can just grab that link from there and go straight to it.
Yeah. And, if people want to sort of discover a little bit more about the importance of conversations, we're running a campaign for the whole of April, which is Stress Awareness Month, and really looking at the difference that leaders can make, as far as stress in the workplace goes. Not just from a kind of duty of care, health and safety position, but also through their own leadership style and behaviours. And that's a free campaign that's running, as I say, throughout the month of April. And again, details of that are on the confidentconversations.co.uk website.
Brilliant. So I'll make sure that I'll get the link for that one as well, specifically, so we can put that in there as well. Cool. That's awesome. Thank you so much for that. Make sure you get in touch with Andrea to have a look at that in April. And thank you for the conversation today. Really enjoyed that.
Me too.
Brilliant stuff. Have a fantastic day. And I'm going to be following to look at your rants on LinkedIn very avidly, because I'm liking the idea of them. I love a good rant on LinkedIn.
All righty. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
No, bye now.
Bye-bye.
So that brings us to the end of the Leadership Untitled podcast for today. This episode will be called Conversations Matter. All that remains is for me to again thank Andrea for joining me today and giving both myself and the listeners some great advice around all things self-leadership and leadership. Andrea, thank you. Also, for you guys listening, thank you for tuning in, and don't forget to subscribe to make sure that you don't miss an episode in future. If you'd like to get in touch with me and ask how I can help you and your organisation, then please do at rob@robmoores.com or take a look at the website of the same name. Speak soon. Bye now.